I'd like to start by reading a small piece of an article you wrote recently on the situation in the Caucasus. American charges of Russian aggression ring hollow. Georgia started this fight. Russia finished it. Will you elaborate on that for us?
Well, certainly the war, this mini-war, was started on the night of August 7th, August 8th, when Georgia launched artillery barrages on the capital of South Ossetia, invaded and occupied the capital, and killed a number of people, including Russian peacekeepers, and sent tens of thousands of people streaming toward North Ossetia into Russia. And that was the beginning of the war. And the Russians, within 24 hours, had acted and sent their troops in and drove the Georgians out and moved into Georgia proper and moved into Abkhazia as well and cleansed South Ossetia of Georgian troops. But Georgia started the war. Saakashvili started the war. There's no doubt about that. And the question is, the Russians knew he was coming because they were prepared clearly and reacted immediately. The question is, did Condi Rice know Saakashvili was going to do this? And did the president, who was in Beijing, know he was going to do this? And I think those are questions that Americans ought to ask.
Why do you think Western news outlets were so quick to jump on headlines such as Russia invades Georgia or Russia attacks Georgia, when clearly the case wasn't that simple?
Well, the case wasn't that simple, and I think it has been, the coverage has been biased, and the coverage has also been incomplete in the sense that the American people weren't told emphatically who started the war. And so what they did get, however, by the time the reporters showed up, is pictures of Russian tanks and Russians moving into South Ossetia and Russians moving into Gori and moving into the western part of Georgia and Russian troops and tanks and all the rest of it. And so I think a number of media fed right into that. Secondly, I think there is a bias against Russia among neoconservatives in the United States and among some of these folks who basically have the vested interest of Saakashvili at heart. And third, quite frankly, the government of the United States did not tell the whole truth. It condemned Russia for excessive violence, it said, disproportionate violence, but it did not talk about the violence and the killing that had initiated the counterattack. And I think that left the American people somewhat in the dark, and I think it's unfair for a government to do that, and it's certainly irresponsible for the media not to provide the perspective that was needed, that Russia did not start this fight, but stepped right in immediately.
Russia has invaded a sovereign neighboring state and threatens a democratic government elected by its people. Such an action is unacceptable in the 21st century. Russia's government must respect Georgia's territorial integrity and sovereignty.
I think they were given the full facts.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to ask you to comment on certainly what many Russian citizens, and I'm not talking about analysts or politicians, just people, and Europeans, when they hear a comment from George Bush condemning Russia, or any other country for that matter, about any kind of invasion of another country.
As John McCain in the 20th century said, in the 21st century, nations do not invade other nations. I think even Dick Cheney was laughing at that one. Because, look, the United States attacked Iraq, a country which did not threaten us, did not want war with us, did not attack us, in order to take away from it weapons it did not have. Everybody knows that now. People know that Israel bombed Lebanon for 35 days because of a border incident in which 2 Israeli soldiers were killed and 2 were captured, in far greater violence than the Russians did in South Ossetia and Georgia. Now, Americans know this. They know we bombed Serbia for 78 days when Serbia had not attacked us, and it was attempting to recapture and redraw in the province that it was losing of Kosovo. So I think if the American people are told these facts, they will understand. Unfortunately, it's all very much, the media is all very much of the moment. They look at the television screen, they say, what happened today? Russian tanks rolled into this little country, little democratic country that's a friend of ours. And that's all they know, and that's all they see, and they're not very...
With its actions in recent days, Russia has damaged its credibility and its relations with the nations of the free world. Bullying and intimidation are not acceptable ways to conduct foreign policy in the 21st century. Only Russia can decide whether it will now put itself back on the path of responsible nations.
So yeah, they're interested in oil, but that's a middle-run interest. Their immediate goal is intimidation. So when people say, for example, which is very frequent, that it's all about oil, of course oil is important, and of course we want control of oil, but oil isn't enough to explain a war on Iraq.
The major reason to take Iraq was a display of imperial power, was to show both the Arab world, but not just them, but to show Europe and the Far Eastern Bloc, China and the Koreans, who was master.
To make it so apparent and so overwhelming at the very outset of potential military operations that the adversary quickly realizes that there is no real alternative here other than to fight and die or to give up.
What will follow will not be a repeat of any other conflict. It will be of a force and scope and scale that has been beyond what has been seen before.
It had been planned for months, and now, one day after that first airstrike, the Pentagon's shock and awe campaign was underway. The idea: to blitz the capital with bombs, to stun the Iraqis into a quick surrender.
This is the beginning of the shock and awe campaign. According to one official, this is going to be the entire 9 yards.
It was a breathtaking display of firepower.
And the Pentagon says, we ain't seen nothing yet.
And we keep talking about this overwhelming force that we're prepared to use. I'm wondering, are you concerned at all that we will be seen as a bully?
For Bashar Assad, it was the first meeting with President Medvedev. More than getting acquainted, he wanted to show his support.
We would like to express our support to Russia's stance in the recent conflict and the situation in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We understand what is behind Russia's position, and we understand Russia's military reaction to the developments. We believe this is a response to Georgia's provocation. We support Moscow in this and are against any attempts to blacken Russia.
Ahead of the visit, there were reports Russia will deploy its missile systems in Syria, in particular the missile complex Iskander that Syria has been asking for a long time.
Right after the recognition of Kosovo, Moscow said that it might set a precedent for South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Today, you've made the decision to support the independence of those republics. Why has Russia done that, and how does it comply with the international law?
I'll begin with the second question. This fully coincides with international law. When the case of Kosovo arose, my colleagues told me this was a particular kind of case, what experts in international affairs call casus sui generis. Each case of recognizing is by its nature a separate case. The special case of Kosovo, a special case in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. We speak about our situation. It's quite obvious that the adoption of our decision is aimed to prevent genocide and annihilation of an entire nation, and to help them to come to their feet. For 17 years, the struggle has been going on for independence of these two non-recognized peoples. In the course of this period, despite all attempts by the international community, nothing was made possible. We practically, until the recent period, tried to help them to restore state unity, but it did not happen. The last nail into this was driven when the decision to start an aggression was made. And that is why, in these conditions, the only way to preserve this people was to recognize as subjects of international law, and to recognize their state independence. That is why our decision is based on international law, on the UN Charter, on the Helsinki Declarations, and other international documents.
Is Russia ready for the consequences of this decision that can result in a long and tough confrontation with the world leading powers? Aren't we afraid of the possibility of the new Cold War?
We are not afraid of anything, of the prospect of a Cold War. Of course, we don't want that. In this situation, everything depends on the stand of our partners, and the world community, and our partners in the West. If they want to preserve good relationships with Russia, they will understand the reason for passing such a decision, and the situation will be calm. But if they choose a confrontational scenario, we will be responsive.